All right, so we're moving on to Chapter 4 today, and we're going to spend a fair amount of time on Chapter 4. I'm going to take it kind of slow to go through this. What Chapter 4 is an introduction to energy in organisms, basically. We're going to talk about different states that energy is found in. We're going to talk about different reactions that occur, so reactions that absorb energy, reactions that require energy, and kind of the things, a lot of subjects around that. Then we'll look at how you transfer energy from one reaction to another. All of this is to lead up into Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, which are on photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So this is a real introductory chapter to energy to get you used to a lot of the terms that we will use through 5 and 6, and to get you kind of thinking about energetics in a cell. So that it'll make 5 and 6 easier to understand. 5 and 6 are going to be pretty tough chapters that we go into a fair amount of detail in, and that's why those two kind of on their own are for one of the tests. So we'll have a test at the end of Chapter 4, and then we'll move on to 5 and 6, and spend a lot of time on photosynthesis and respiration. We're also going to talk a little bit more about membranes and things crossing membranes and a lot of the processes that are going to help respiration and photosynthesis. So some parts of this, especially the beginning of this, are really kind of abstract. We're not going to be talking about specific reactions, but we're going to talk about reactions as a whole. So bear with me and ask lots of questions as we go through. Okay, so you probably know this just intuitively, but cells need energy to survive. So cells need to somehow capture energy, and then they need to somehow apply that energy or use energy to do things. Energy is the ability to do work. That's kind of a general definition of it. So if you don't have any energy, you can't do any work. And that applies to you as well as to your cells. So your cells have work to do. Their work is chemical reactions, is transporting material from one place to another, is producing proteins, regulating things going across membranes. There's a lot of different things, and then contraction to make your muscles move, and everything that you need to get through your life. Neurons firing so you can have thoughts going on inside your head. There's lots of different work that cells need to do. Living cells are chemical factories, and many of the reactions that your cells perform that allow you to go about your daily life require energy. So organisms have to be able to extract energy from something else, convert it into a form that they can use to power some of these chemical reactions, and then they need to apply it to a chemical reaction. So those steps, extracting energy, converting it, and applying it to perform work, is really what this chapter is about. So how, in general, how do these things happen? And then when we get into the next two chapters, we're going to look at very specific reactions, reactions of photosynthesis, reactions of cellular respiration, and how are these processes done in those very specific situations. So energy is the ability to do work, and living cells have to be able to extract it and then apply it. Okay, so there are generally two types of energy. If we can boil down into the simplest terms, energy exists in two forms: potential energy and kinetic energy. Potential energy is stored energy. It's energy that is available to do work or potentially available to do work. This can be energy that's potential energy because of different reasons. It could be potential energy based on the location of something. So we'll talk about concentration gradients later on, kind of the end of this chapter. But if you think about it in terms of outside of the cell, prime example, and I'll show you this later on, someone standing on top of a diving board. They're high up in the air. They are not moving at that time, but they have the potential to fall into the pool. They have a lot of potential energy based on their location. So location can be one means of potential energy. Potential energy can also be because of structure. So chemical energy, the energy stored in bonds of things, is a big example of potential energy based on structure. So think outside of a cell again, like a explosive, so a firecracker, something like that. That has a lot of potential energy based on the chemical structure of the molecules inside of it, and that is potential to have this explosive release of energy. But it's just potential energy at that point. It's stored up. It's available to do work. So the opposite of potential energy would be kinetic energy. Kinetic energy is energy that's being used to do work. So when that diver jumps off the platform, they are now moving. The energy that was stored up based on their location being high up on the platform is now being released as they fall to the water. Right? So that's a form of kinetic energy. That firecracker, or that firework that is exploding and releasing light and heat and sound, that is kinetic energy as well. So examples of kinetic energy involve light, sound, movement. Movement is a big thing, so kinetic energy often involves motion of some sort. So movement of atoms, movement of molecules, muscle contraction, these are all forms of kinetic energy. So potential energy is stored energy. Kinetic energy is energy that's being used to do some sort of work. Okay. So with that little bit of introduction, out of these five, which one would you say is potential energy? Okay. Last one's good. Okay, so good. That was pretty obvious, I guess. So glucose. Right, so muscle contractions involves movement of muscles. You're actually performing a task, that is energy being released. Water rushing over Niagara Falls, water is moving. If I had said water sitting at the top of Niagara Falls, what kind of energy would that be? That would be potential, right? But the water that's actually falling over the falls and moving, that's kinetic energy. Light flashes, you've got light, you've got probably heat as well. It's a chemical reaction that's occurring that is releasing this light. So that is also kinetic energy. Flight of an insect, there's obvious movement involved there, that's kinetic. Molecule of glucose, it's a prime example of potential energy. This is why we like to eat sweet things. So glucose, sugar, stored up energy in its bonds that is potential to be released. So, right. So a molecule of glucose is potential energy. The rest of those are all examples of kinetic energy. Okay, one way that we measure potential energy is with something called a calorie. So a calorie is a measure of potential energy. So if you ever see that nutritional information on any food packaging, that's what it's telling you. It's telling you within this food that you're about to consume, it has this much potential energy in it. So your body could get this much energy to your cells from this object to do work. So a typical energy bar has 240 calories, and calories with a capital C is actually 1 kilocalorie, or 1,000 calories with a lowercase c. So that's actually 240,000 calories that are in something. But I guess that number would be scary, so food manufacturers have started using calorie with a capital C so they can write a smaller looking number. Right? So we convert energy all the time So you eat that energy bar, and that powers your muscles to ride your bike up a hill. So you've converted that potential energy from the energy bar into kinetic energy of muscle motion to get you up the hill. So by riding up the hill, you're actually building up potential energy based on location. So you can then coast down the hill without using muscle contractions. So you don't need to supply energy. There was potential energy built up by riding up that hill. Right? So energy can be converted from one form to another. Okay. So here's just kind of an example. This is not a slide that I gave you, but here's some examples of typical food sources. So broccoli has one cup of broccoli has about 25 calories in it. A cheeseburger has about 295 calories in it. So different amounts of food, or different kinds of food have different caloric values. They have different amounts of potential energy. Same as different activities. So running for 7-minute mile for, I don't know what it says. Whatever, it doesn't have time in here. But running can burn 979 calories. In 1 hour. If you're running a 7-minute mile for 1 hour, you're going to burn a lot of calories. But if you're just sitting for an hour, you still burn some, but not very much, 28 calories. So sitting right here for the next hour, you're burning about 28 calories. So you could burn off the 1 cup of broccoli you had for breakfast, right? But you probably didn't have broccoli for breakfast. You probably had something with a higher caloric intake, so you're probably not burning all that energy. But you could think about food in terms of this. You could say, well, what did I do? How many calories did I burn today versus how many calories did I eat? And this is the way a lot of diet plans work. You just simply count calories, and if the calories that you burn is higher than the calories that you ate, you're going to lose weight because you're going to have to tap into some stored calories. If it's the other way around, if you eat more calories than you burn, which a lot of us do, you're going to get fat. Yeah, you're going to store some of that weight for later, right? So that's one method. It's really kind of hard to do because there's a lot of stuff that burns calories that you don't know about. So we usually assume that the typical person burns a certain number of calories just by being alive for a day, but that's not always true. So the math is sometimes hard to work out, but in general, that's true. So we're going to talk about how this happens in the next few chapters. We'll talk about how do we get the energy out of this and convert it into a form that we can apply to things like this. But that's the idea here. So again, just another graphic saying the same thing. Energy can be converted from one form to another. So if I go back to my diver example, a diver on top of the platform has a lot of potential energy. They jump into the water. They are converting their potential energy to kinetic energy. This kinetic energy is going to get converted into kinetic energy of the water moving, the splash, the sound, probably some heat loss as well. So they now have very little potential energy. If they want to build up their potential energy again, they're going to have to climb up the ladder, which is kinetic energy, and that kinetic energy is coming from whatever they ate that morning. So we're constantly converting energy from one form to another, whether we're converting our food into muscle motion, or we're converting muscle motion into potential energy, being on the top of the diving platform, being on the top of the hill, like that, or we're converting potential energy back into kinetic energy, jumping off of something like that. We're constantly converting energy from one form to another. So, studying these transfers or conversions of energy is something that biologists do. We want to know, well, how do we convert that energy bar into muscle motion, and how does that work? So this process, the study of transfer of energy from one form to another, is called thermodynamics. So thermodynamics is the study of energy transfer. Here's just a diagram from your book of different energy transfers in a biological system. So here is a deer that is eating leaves off of a tree. They're taking the sugar from the leaves, that's potential energy. They're converting it through cellular respiration into chemical energy that they can use to do cellular tasks, move, something like that. They're releasing heat as a byproduct. That sugar, that potential energy, had to come from somewhere. That came from a process called photosynthesis, where the leaves captured energy from sunlight, sunlight is kinetic energy. It's being produced by the sun by a chemical reaction, because there's lots of potential energy in the sun that is being converted into kinetic energy. And they convert that kinetic energy into potential energy, and some heat is lost as well. So thermodynamics is the study of these energy transformations. And thermodynamics has a few laws that describe these, and we're going to spend a teeny bit of time going into the two laws of thermodynamics, two main laws. The first one's pretty straightforward. Should be the easier of the two to grasp. The second one's a little bit more out there. It's a little more complex. First law says energy cannot be created or destroyed. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be transformed or transferred. So transformed, it can be converted from one form to another, from potential to kinetic, from kinetic to potential, from one form of potential to another form of potential, things like that. Or it can be transferred, which means it can be moved from one organism to another, so from the tree to the deer. If that deer was to be shot by a hunter and made into sausages, that's now being converted into potential energy for that hunter's family to eat. So it can be transferred or transformed, but it can't be created or destroyed. So this basically tells us that all the energy that's out there is already out there in some form or another, which means organisms can't spontaneously produce energy. They need to get it from some source, whether it's through getting it by eating something or getting it from the sun, which plants do. Okay, so that should be pretty straightforward. That's the first law of thermodynamics, right? The second law is a little more complex, and so I'll tell you it, and then I'll kind of go into some explanation of what some of these terms mean. Second law of thermodynamics says that all energy transformations lead to some energy being lost as heat and increase something called entropy. And entropy is a really hard term to really understand, so I'm going to explain it in the next few slides. But second law, so all energy transformation, basically it's saying that all energy transformations lose some energy and increase disorder in the universe. So entropy, as I'll show you, is a measure of disorder. And actually the second law of thermodynamics is a kind of depressing law of thermodynamics. It's basically saying that every time anything happens to energy, global disorder is increasing. And we won't get it back. Okay, so to explain this, here's a few examples, and then we'll come back to that a little bit. So entropy is equivalent to disorder. It's a little more complex than that, but you can basically just think about the word entropy as disorder. And the concept of entropy is that disorder is the natural state of things, I guess, that things will progress towards disorder. And you might feel this way. So this is kind of a silly example, but saying that you have a nice clean room, over time that room becomes disorganized and messy, and it seems that this happens without any energy input. You don't, just naturally over time, disorder ensues, right? If you want to go from this messy dorm room back to the nice clean dorm room, it's going to take organized effort and lots of energy input. So it takes energy to make things ordered, but it seemingly doesn't take any energy for things to become disordered. Things will become disordered naturally. That's kind of half of this second law. And this, you might say, well, she moved a lot of the stuff around, and that took energy. But the idea is kind of outside of this, that things will naturally fall apart. And you can think about like home maintenance. If you don't maintain your home over time, it's going to deteriorate and maybe fall apart. So you need to constantly be putting energy in to keep it in this organized state. So abandoned homes, and if any of you have foreclosed homes that have been abandoned around you, over time, everything grows up around them. They get really covered in mold and various things, and they start looking like they're going to fall down, right? So over time, disorder happens naturally. Order takes a lot of energy. So that's one part of entropy. Second part of entropy is the idea that an increase in complexity is associated with an increase in this disorder, this entropy. So we've seen you probably see lots of houses or buildings being constructed. So that's incredibly ordered structures being made, but there's always a big pile of waste. Right? There's always a big pile of debris or packaging or whatever, the bits of wood that have been cut off, piles of rubble somewhere. And there's also big piles of sawdust. So there's always this associated disorder around the creation of order. And maybe your kitchen looks like this after you cook, hopefully not, but you're baking a cake and you have dirty dishes to clean up afterwards. You always have some kind of disorder. Yep.
Disorder or the other word?
Entropy? Well, entropy means disorder. I'm kind of saying that yeah, don't worry too much about remembering entropy. That's the overall concept that I'm trying to get across. So in order to create complexity, there's also going to be disorder or entropy associated with it. Okay, so the second law of thermodynamics says that anytime energy is transferred, transformed, converted, that global entropy or global disorder is increased. So the implications of this are that organisms can only increase their complexity as long as something else decreases in complexity by a greater amount. So this flower, this orchid, has beautiful complexity and symmetry to it. But at the same time, in order to get to this, it had to break down sugar molecules. It had to probably release a lot of heat. There was an associated increase in disorder. How about humans? So humans grow. As we grow, we have more and more complex systems. Think about a child that's developing. They're growing these very complex brains. They're growing very complex organs. So what is the associated disorder that happens at the same time? So in order for you to grow, what else is happening at the same time that would increase or what is decreasing in complexity as you are increasing in complexity? You think about what I mean by this?
Like you're a baby,
Yeah.
a lot more bones, so when you grow up, there's less bones.
Well, that's the increase in complexity. You're growing larger. You're building these longer bones. I guess you're thinking, number-wise. I guess so. But in order to grow, what has to happen? Yeah, it's a little simpler than you're thinking, right? You have to eat, and when you eat, you take food that is complex and you break it down into carbon dioxide, which we're going to learn about in the next few chapters, and water. So you are taking these complex things like food sources and breaking them down into non-complex things. And that's the disorder that's associated with you being able to grow. And there's also associated waste with that too. So kids are always surrounded by waste too. Right? They break down. Yeah, you have you have waste products. So exactly. So that's it. Is that there's disorder associated with it. So and that's what the second law basically states, is that in order to change from energy from one form to another, there's also going to be an associated disorder, so that we don't actually have a global increase in complexity. And really, more so than just breaking down the food that you eat or creating waste, you create heat as a byproduct, and heat is probably the most disorganized form of energy there is. Heat is just movement of molecules relative to each other, and you probably notice this when you eat a lot. Most people get warmer. All the reactions, because what you're doing, you are converting the energy from that food into an energy called ATP, and in the process, every reaction is going to release a little bit of heat. So all of a sudden, you're doing all these reactions, converting all this energy, so you're going to release this disorganized form of energy called heat. Well, they also have a large surface area to volume, so they lose heat really quickly because they're small. Whereas when you're larger, you retain your heat better. But yeah, I don't know, there's going to be associated change in complexity of energy around you. So heat, waste, exactly. Okay, so that's it. That's enough for that. Okay, so here's another question that kind of gets at this a little bit. So over here, there's 1, 2, 3 states of this light bulb. Assume that this is kind of right before impact, and this is right after impact, which it wouldn't be the other way around, right? At which stage is potential energy, 1, 2, or 3, the highest? And then second, at which stage is entropy the highest? So can you see all these numbers? Okay, good job. So most of you said the last one, 1 and 3, and you'd be right. So 1, yeah. So 1 would be the highest potential energy. It's the furthest away from the surface, so by its location, it's got a lot of potential energy. 2 is actually in the process of converting that potential energy into kinetic energy. The motion is kinetic energy, so it's right. This would be probably maybe the highest kinetic energy at the time. And then 3, it's got the highest entropy because it's now disordered. So we've now converted that kinetic energy into all these different forms of energy: sound, probably heat, and the energy is being used to break the bonds, and that's going to release energy in different forms. So the energy is now really disorganized here. So that would be entropy is really high here. Your potential energy is really high. Okay? All right. So the answer would be E. Okay. So now we have that was a general overview of types of energy: potential energy, kinetic energy, conversion of energy. We're going to start going a little bit more specific. So gradually we're going to get more and more into organisms. And we're going to talk a little bit about metabolism, and then generic kinds of energy changes in metabolic reactions. So metabolism is really just a study of all of an organism's chemical processes. You probably mostly hear the term metabolism when you're thinking about conversion of food into energy and your ability to not gain weight when you do that, right? That's really part of it is probably the efficiency of converting energy from food that you eat. But it has to do with really any chemical reaction that occurs in an organism. And over the next 2 chapters after this, we're going to talk about 2 very specific metabolic pathways. Metabolic pathways are pathways that consume energy to build complicated molecules from simpler ones, and they release energy by breaking down biomolecules. So they are steps to do either of those processes, to either consume energy or to release energy from molecules. So we're going to talk about photosynthesis, which is going to consume energy to build molecules, and then we'll talk about respiration, which is going to release energy by breaking down molecules. All metabolic pathways, pretty much all metabolic pathways, or the majority of them in organisms, are not a single step, they're multi-step. They take a starting molecule and they convert it through a series of reactions into the product. And so we'll spend time over those next 2 chapters talking about the different steps within photosynthesis and respiration. And each reaction, so going from A to B, this is one reaction, is going to require something called an enzyme. And over the next few lectures, we're going to talk a little bit about enzymes and things that affect enzymes, because they will play a huge role in photosynthesis and respiration. So enzymes will aid in the conversion of A to B, and B to C, and C to D. And there's going to be a different enzyme for each reaction within this process. So we're going to spend a lot of time studying metabolic pathways, but first I want to talk about kind of an overview of the 2 different kinds of metabolic pathways. We've got a metabolic pathway that consumes energy to build molecules, and then we've got metabolic pathways that release energy by breaking down biomolecules. So as biologists, we're interested in knowing which type of reaction we're looking at. Are we looking at a reaction that is building things up, or are we looking at a reaction that's breaking things down? And do the reactions that we're looking at require energy to be put into them, or are they going to release energy? So we're interested in something called the energy change of a reaction, because this will tell us whether a reaction occurs spontaneously or not. And by spontaneous, I don't mean rapidly or not. I mean it'll happen without any energy input, or will it require energy input to occur? So in order to know whether a reaction is spontaneous or not, we need to know how energy changes throughout the course of the reaction. And we can do this by plotting the energy change, or the change in potential energy, using a free energy diagram. And what a free energy diagram is going to look like is we're going to have the sort of time on this axis, and it's going from the start of the reaction to the end of the reaction. And we have something called free energy, which is also uses the letter G for it. So sometimes you might see the letter G in your textbook. That's a measure of free energy. Free energy is basically a measure of potential energy. So reactions will either go where you have your something like this, where your reactant has a lot of free energy and your product has very little free energy, or they would go like this, where you have a reactant with very low free energy and your product with very high free energy. So product, again, is what comes out of your reaction. That's the result of your reaction. And reactant is what you start with. So let's go back to my diving board example. So diver on the diving board has a lot of potential energy, right? And they jump into the pool and they don't have nearly as much free energy. So which one of these 2 diagrams would represent that process? The one on the left or the one on the right? On the left. So yeah, so the diver started with a lot of free energy. They end with very little free energy. So how about the diver in the water wants to get back on the platform? So the diver in the water needs to climb up the ladder to get to the platform. So which? That would be the right. Okay. So very simply, so your reactants have less free energy than your products. So reactions like this, where your reactants have more free energy than your products, are like your diver jumping in the pool. Here we have reactants have less free energy than the products, is like the diver climbing up the platform. Which one of these required energy input? That one, right? And which one did not require energy input on the part of the diver? That one, okay. So if you go from high reactants to low free energy products, it's not going to require energy input, so it's going to be spontaneous. And if you have a reaction like this, it's going to require energy input, so it's not going to be spontaneous. So processes with a negative energy change, so here G is going from high to low, so this distance, which is delta G, is negative, and here your delta G, or change in G, is positive. So only processes with a negative energy change, or a negative change in free energy, or delta G, will occur spontaneously. Spontaneous processes can be harnessed to do work. So here's another example of a spontaneous process. Examples outside the cell are sometimes easier to grasp at first. So here's a hydroelectric system. So you have water that has a lot of potential energy based on its location at the top of a hydroelectric system at this top chamber. Down here, this chamber is much lower, so it has a lot less free energy. So as the water goes downhill, it has a negative delta G, and because of this, it can be used to turn a turbine to generate energy, and this energy can then be used to do work, like turn on a light bulb. Okay, so processes with a negative change in free energy, or a negative delta G, will happen spontaneously and can be harnessed to do work. So there are names for each of these types of reactions. So a reaction with a negative delta G that occurs spontaneously, and a reaction with a positive delta G have a different name for them, for each of them. So that's kind of... So which? Yeah, spontaneous is going to have a negative delta G because it goes from a high to a low. So you're subtracting free energy, right? And here you need to add in free energy, so it has a positive delta G, right? So, yeah. So we're going to, the next two slides kind of explain these two different ones a little bit more. Okay, so starting off with this one on the right, the positive change, pathways that consume energy are called endergonic, and they have a positive delta G. So they're going to consume energy to build complex molecules from simpler ones. So an example of this that we'll talk about in the next chapter is photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is going to take carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide has a fairly low free energy. You're going to combine them together to form glucose, which has a very high free energy. That process is not going to occur spontaneously. It's going to require energy input. And where does photosynthesis get its energy from? From sunlight, right? So it's going to require input of sunlight to combine carbon dioxide and water to make glucose. So here's the reactants have a low free energy, the products have a high free energy, and you're going to have to supply this delta G. So this distance between the reactants and the products, that's the amount of energy that's needed to get that reaction to go forward. So you need to put in that much energy. So here is another example of this is, let's say you're raising a barn, trying to put up the walls of a barn. You need to input energy. So either through people physically pulling on the ropes to get that barn to go up, or we'd probably use a crane down here, right? So you need to burn energy to construct that structure. So endergonic, positive delta G consumes energy to build things. And so the same thing with that diver climbing up the platform, required energy input from muscle movement to increase the potential energy of where they were. Okay. And the opposite of an endergonic reaction is something called an exergonic reaction. exergonic reactions have a negative delta G, and they will release energy by breaking down complex molecules into simpler compounds. And this is what cellular respiration is. Cellular respiration will break down things like glucose into carbon dioxide. So you eat a hamburger, you breathe in oxygen, and you breathe out carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide that you're breathing out is actually the breakdown product of that hamburger that you ate. All the sugars that were in that hamburger are being exhaled. And that's a much less energetic product. You have released the energy from the hamburger, and you're using it now to walk around campus, right? So you have taken a very highly energetic product or reactant, converted it into a less energetic product, and the distance between the reactants and the products is the amount of energy that's been released. Okay. Okay. I'll ask this question and we might stop there. So what of these is true for all exergonic reactions? Okay, so this one on the left, is that exergonic or endergonic? This is going from high reactants to low products. This is going to be exergonic. And then this one on the right would be endergonic. So the diver on the platform is jumping into the pool versus the diver climbing up the ladder. Which one do you think requires a net input of energy from the surroundings? The diver jumping off the platform or the diver climbing up the ladder? Climbing up the ladder. So endergonic reactions require a net input of energy. I asked about exergonic reactions. So that would be this one where you are releasing energy. So breakdown of your food is this kind, whereas photosynthesis is this kind. So exergonic is releasing, endergonic is absorbing. So more of you got that than the others. So net release of energy would be the right answer. So C is the right one. So products have more total energy than the reactants. That's also endergonic. This one, B, the reaction is rapid. That has nothing to do with this. The speed of the reaction has nothing to do with this. It's all about whether the reaction needs energy or it releases energy. Okay, so we'll pick up here on Wednesday, and we'll start talking about what links these reactions. Okay.